The patient who is on dialysis
is going to die 40
years earlier than someone without kidney disease.
Another decades.
It's outrageous. A person on dialysis at 25 or 30 is like an 80-year-old.
The key to your future longevity could be in your kidneys, but the way we live silently harms them.
Until kidney function drops below 15%, you don't start having any symptoms.
They are a ticking time bomb. Today we are joined by Dr. Borja Bandera, a medical specialist in nephrology, a researcher with more than 120 scientific articles on kidney health, and the best communicator in his field in Spain.
People can't lose their healthy habits and then just take a pill of X supplement thinking that's enough.
What limitations does a patient with one kidney have? None. None? None. What is Klotho? How can I tell if my kidneys work well? Has my creatinine increased? Should I worry? We answer all these questions and many more today here on Mejor que Ayer. Welcome, Dr. Borja Bandera. Well, Borja, welcome back to Amala. How are you?
Thank you very much. I'm delighted. Thank you for inviting me here again, and thank you for inviting me to Malaga as well, which is a city I really love, honestly.
Thank you, because I love that you're a guy who, wherever you're called to talk about kidneys, you go, and I love that. You're spreading your specialty all over the world.
I'm fully committed to the cause.
Committed to the cause, and people are really starting to understand the importance of taking care of kidney health. So today we're going to talk about the connection between many things. Honestly, the show has a lot to offer today, but above all, I wanted to start with the connection between nephrology and longevity, right? Two topics that people might not usually connect. So you wrote a new book that arrived at my house a few months ago, and I love it. We discussed the cover and content. I really like it. It highlights the link between longevity and nephrology, which I think people here don't know about. So how are longevity, or how long we can live, and especially how well or poorly we live, connected to kidney health?
This highlights one of the kidney's lesser-known roles, right? Most people just think it's responsible for filtering and purifying the body's waste. But the kidney has a lot of additional functions that go beyond just waste purification. And one of them is that, well, saying it holds the key to longevity might be too much, but it definitely plays a big role in how we age. And this, above all, happens through several processes affecting the kidney, which I'm sure we'll talk about all of them. But most importantly, what's most novel is through the protein Klotho. A protein that has been in the spotlight a lot lately. I want to believe that, in part, thanks to the awareness we raise about kidney health, it is indeed a protein that is found specifically in the kidney. We are born with this protein. When our kidneys reset at birth, we have 100 of Klotho. And over time, or with some things that happen to us throughout life, Klotho levels decrease. And what happens if Klotho levels decrease? Well, what we saw at the beginning in Klotho knockout kidneys, that is, kidneys from which Klotho was removed. In experimental animals, usually mice, and later in humans, we've seen that it is associated with markedly accelerated aging. I'm not even saying accelerated anymore, I'm saying very accelerated because, for example, mice that don't have Klotho die during their mouse adolescence. In other words, we're talking about mortality happening far too early. Applied to the real world of nephrology and kidney health, it means that a patient who is on dialysis, for example, whose kidneys don't work at all, and who, let's say, is 25 years old,
will be 40
years earlier than someone without kidney disease.
Another few decades is outrageous.
If a patient has kidney disease, more than half their life can be lost to it. That's what the disease does.
So then, it is said that Klotho is not found in the skin or the intestine. It is a protein exclusive to the kidneys. Yes. Okay. And I was going to ask you, is there any known genetic disease in humans that reduces Klotho, or besides, let's say, chronic kidney disease? Is there something genetic that reduces or cancels out Klotho?
Basically, no, or at least not that we know of right now. It's mostly related to kidney disease and to some habits, some behavioral changes in humans. That's what has been shown to lower Klotho. Plus, Klotho was found in a rather odd way.
How is it, bueno?
Researchers discovered this through experimental animals with a Klotho knockout, though that wasn't their original goal. They weren't checking if it was linked to longevity, just its function in the kidney. Klotho's role there is to remove phosphorus. At first it seemed unrelated to longevity, but it was actually closely connected. And in fact, this phosphorus, this relationship between phosphorus and Klotho, is what has actually led us to think about which habits can modify these Klotho levels.
That happens a lot in science, right? To find out the function of a protein, what researchers do is remove the protein from the mouse and see what happens. Of course, in this case, well, they died much earlier. Of course, they said, well, we remove Klotho, phosphorus in the blood will increase, which is a really bad thing, and I think we'll talk about that a bit later, but that's not all. I mean, yes, of course.
Phosphorus in the blood did increase, but that wasn't the problem. The problem is that these mice died right away, didn't they? So from there, that's where the research on Klotho began.
Where's the word from? I'm not sure if it's Japanese.
I don't know. It's from Greek mythology. Greek. And actually, it's very beautiful because she's the Greek goddess who spins the thread of life. That is, like the one in charge in Hercules.
That one?
In fact, if you notice, this is a thread. Look, it's on purpose, of course. It's like the decision maker, right? That's where this cool anti-aging protein name comes from.
That's great. Yeah, now I get the thread of life, right? Of course. They tried to cut it in Hercules and couldn't because he was immortal. Exactly.
That's
great. Well, and then Klotho says that the primary function is to eliminate phosphorus through the kidney. Of course, because high phosphorus in the blood is harmful.
It's harmful. When someone develops kidney disease, that's actually the first thing that occurs. Even with glomerular filtration rates, which is kind of the way we estimate how the kidney is working, that are very high. Some say that even with normal filtration rates, phosphorus retention begins as soon as they decrease. Since phosphorus is harmful to the body because what it does, for example, is bind to the calcium in the blood and stick to the blood vessels, which is bad, of course, the kidney immediately activates mechanisms to eliminate this phosphorus. And it does this through I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it's a compound that Klotho forms with a protein called FGF23, which is precisely responsible for creating a channel to eliminate phosphorus. Actually, what it does is prevent more phosphorus from being reabsorbed, but that's fine. In our minds, it's as if it eliminates more phosphorus and starts to get rid of it to continuously normalize phosphorus levels. Of course, when we start to have more advanced kidney disease, when kidney disease progresses, all these functions begin to stop. The functions related to phosphorus elimination don't work as well, like everything when an organ is damaged, right? And that's when we start to accumulate phosphorus in the blood. And this is the main function through which Klotho is discovered in its combination with FGF23.
So part of that accelerated aging comes from an exaggerated vascular calcification that we see in kidney patients.
That's right. It's actually the leading cause of death in kidney disease. The usual cardiovascular events with any type of glomerular filtration, with any type of function, even when we start losing proteins in the urine and the filtration is still normal. So these patients mostly die from cardiovascular events.
And which everyday habits reduce Klotho without us knowing it.
Of course. I mean, the question would be,
what harms the kidney also harms Klotho.
Without any doubt. Any kidney injury, no matter what kind, will harm Klotho levels. It's true that if the injury is temporary, for example, I get dehydrated, the kidney suffers, I rehydrate, recover function, and recover Klotho levels. So, it's important to know how our kidney function is because there are many measures that can restore kidney function or prevent it from getting worse. But then we move on to habits. One of them, which has to do with phosphorus, is nutrition, obviously, phosphorus as well, especially in organic phosphorus, which you know is the one found in additives, which is really bad, and it's a bit different from organic phosphorus, which is the one found in foods like fish and meats, in organic form in a more physiological way. Why are they different? Well, mainly because inorganic phosphorus in the intestine, in the digestive tract, is absorbed 100%, which means it contributes much more than organic phosphorus to forcing this continuous elimination of phosphorus through the kidney and through Klotho. What happens with this overexposure to ultra-processed foods? Well, the kidney, in its need to eliminate that phosphorus, starts to use up, in quotes, use up the levels of Klotho, it uses up the protein, and then we start to decrease. If we eat ultra-processed foods, we age. That's true. Many people tell me they've eaten ultra-processed foods, are quitting now, but wonder how to restore their Klotho levels. Well, to restore Klotho levels, there's only one measure that has been proven so far to achieve it, and that's physical exercise. And also, I like it because physical exercise, when it comes to longevity, affects Klotho, but it also affects telomeres. It touches on pretty much all the pathways related to anti-aging. So physical exercise, especially strength training, is the only measure that has been proven so far to be able to restore Klotho levels. I'm not saying you can eat French fries daily just because you'll go to the gym and restore Klotho. Eventually, it all adds up. And then, something that's very trendy and was published just about a year ago is the relationship between chronic stress and Klotho levels. And also, the study where this theory was announced was very interesting because it involved caregivers of children with autism spectrum disorder. Wow. So, caregivers were compared, usually female caregivers, mothers, direct caregivers, and so on, of children with autism disorder versus others who had children without an autism spectrum disorder. Their necks were measured and their Klotho levels were measured. And it's not a clinical trial, but it did give a clue to realize that this chronic stress family, which sometimes may seem like it doesn't have an organic impact, right? Which is not as brutal as the stress we know that raises cortisol and causes us harm, was actually related. It was related to Klotho levels.
In other words, a new way chronic stress ages us. Exactly. Klotho could modulate it.
Yes, and it's unrelated to cortisol. It had nothing to do with it and hasn't been proven. It's related since the signaling pathways are similar, but no study has shown that higher cortisol means lower Klotho. More chronic cortisol means less Klotho.
How interesting. So we're opening the door to say that, well, taking care of stress and managing it well is also taking care of kidney health. Absolutely, without any doubt.
And going back to phosphorus,
okay, additives are a source of phosphorus, all the ones with the X suffix, right? But there are some other products, foods that contain it. For example, I think I remember that soft drinks, right? Non-carbonated soft drinks, processed meats.
all ultra-processed foods, all flavor enhancers that sometimes go a bit unnoticed, thinking they're natural things. And of course, industrial pastries have it. I think so. Yes. Basically, all ultra-processed foods. Yes, everything that requires a bit more preservation than you would expect, right? Yes. Well, that's also coated with phosphorus. Phosphorus is an excellent preservative, and that's why it's full of...
And the energy drinks that 15-year-old kids drink.
14, without a doubt. And that's where we have to be careful with those zero labels. Sometimes they remind me a bit of those old bio labels, right? In the end, almost none of them were actually bio. Well, zero does mean zero sugar, but it's not zero of other things, right? And we know they have these additives that contain inorganic phosphorus. I'm still waiting for a clinical trial where patients are randomized to receive zero drinks versus not, and then see the levels.
And surely, of course, the ethics committees don't
let you do it.
We can't give it to people, of course. Does it also have some kind of impact or correlation on mental health? I mean, I wonder, does Klotho also have a relationship with good or bad mental health? Is it a relationship or causality?
Proven as such, there is no kidney-brain connection. And in fact, the rates, for example, of depression and other behavioral disorders do have a greater impact on people who have kidney disease. But beyond stress and speaking specifically about Klotho, up to now, no. That connection through Klotho has not been proven. Yes, through other ways. As I mentioned, dementia rates are 3 times higher in people with kidney disease and 5 times higher in those on dialysis.
They also have worse cardiovascular health and chronic inflammation, right?
Exactly. That's why I say that specifically through Klotho.
That's what needs to be further investigated, of course. So, well, we know that a young kidney can make the rest of the organs and systems work better. But one thing I want to investigate today, and that we'll look into later, is the communication between the kidney and the rest of the organs. Crosstalk, right?
The crosstalk?
Which is so trendy right now. So the kidney does communicate with the rest of the organs and systems.
All the organs communicate with each other, but in the kidney, we've started to see this much more clearly recently. Beyond the cardiovascular events we've mentioned before, the cardiovascular risk, which is of course very obvious, we've known this for many years. To the point that, as I said, a person on dialysis at 25 or 30 years old is like someone who is 80. If they weren't on dialysis, their real age would be 25 or 30. Right? Now, it's very trendy, for example, the connection with the gut and with the microbiota. Also with other organs, like I said, neurologically, even with the skin, the lungs, the liver, we have those connections. But now the microbiota, which is so trendy, and it makes sense that it is, has allowed us to observe how it behaves, how the microbiota is modulated in people who have chronic kidney disease, and like I said, it's dysregulated. I mean, in people with chronic kidney disease, the microbiota shifts until it becomes pathogenic, and that makes them progress further in kidney disease. And the opposite is also true. A pathological microbiota is related to the development and progression of the disease.
It's a vicious cycle.
Of course, and it has a lot to do with inflammation, with oxidative stress, and well, with these pathological reactions of the microbiota, which which of course are harmful across all organ systems. And with the kidney, I'm telling you, it's already been proven.
It's another way to support the kidney by focusing on digestive health, right?
Yes, and many times we don't place much importance on it with patients, right?
Sometimes professionals don't give enough importance to the diet patients need to follow.
That's why I'm telling you, yes, that we don't give it importance when it comes to the patients. And to say, no, well, it's just that even, but when they already had more obvious symptoms, why? You know that the microbiota, in the end, has the difficulty that in a conventional consultation, it can't be measured, so it's hard to set guidelines, but gastrointestinal alterations in patients with kidney disease, which we've also let go unnoticed without focusing on them, right? Yes. It's like the last step, right? The alterations of the microbiota. Yes, I said this is really bad, you have a lot of discomfort, and so on.
Also, a good line of research would be to see if the dietary guidelines, which are sometimes quite restrictive, that we give to kidney patients can affect the microbiota for better or worse, right?
Absolutely. We've been so strict that we've even taken fruits and vegetables away from patients because they had too much potassium. Those fruits and vegetables had fiber that blocked potassium absorption, so what did we give patients instead? If there's a specialty that has prohibited many healthy nutritional guidelines for many years, it's probably been us. But it's also something that, of course, I did 20 years ago when they couldn't eat anything. The patient would come in and I'd say, you can't eat this, and this, and the patient would leave and come back. At the next appointment, they'd say they know what not to eat, but ask what they should eat, especially since we've even banned foods like fruit and vegetables that shouldn't be. Well, there are cases. I mean, not everyone with advanced chronic kidney disease goes to their nephrologist with a potassium level of 6 or 6.5.
And not just bananas.
Of course, and eats every day, eats 3 liters of gazpacho every day, right? Obviously, it should be moderated, but that's a far cry from banning it without alternatives as well. Yeah.
We discussed this in the other episode. I think it really needs to improve. In this case, within, nephrology and also all the nutrition professionals who see nephropathy patients, which are many.
We've made a lot of progress in that. For example, the incorporation of nutritionists into nephrology services is becoming a golden rule. And in fact, for us to accredit our units, which, as you know, is like giving the seal of quality to the advanced chronic kidney disease units, which is a basic consultation in the entire nephrology care process. It is required to have a nutritional assessment, also a psychological one, by the way, which I also like to mention, but also a nutritional one. And although the public health service almost never accepts this, we found a way. Through the endocrinology and nutrition service, or through some grants we obtained, some awards to be able to incorporate nutritionists, we are convinced of that.
They're being incorporated gradually.
The difference is significant. It's someone who can spend an hour with a patient.
Of course, and
the hospital doctor, a nephrologist, does what he can.
Yes. To recap a bit, we've said that to increase Klotho or not decrease it, physical exercise, especially strength training, is fundamental. I understand that aerobic exercise is important too.
Yes. I emphasize strength training because it's still less common today, right? When you tell a patient, you have to exercise, they immediately think of running or swimming or playing tennis, right? And they don't think as much about strength training. So that's why I really emphasize it, and also because you know that now studies are very focused on showing the benefits of muscle, right?
Yes, because preserving muscle is also important as an endocrine organ, as a functional organ.
Another very important crosstalk, of course, muscle and its myokines.
Second point, we said to eliminate phosphorus, especially inorganic phosphorus, which is mainly found in additives, soft drinks, and ultra-processed foods in general. Any other recommendations to increase Klotho expression?
To increase it? No. To preserve it and try to limit chronic stress as much as possible, and obviously to do an annual screening for kidney disease. You know, I'm obsessed with this. I think it can be done for the whole population. It costs nothing, just €1. €1, right? €1. €1 to do a full screening. I mean, I want to say measuring creatinine in the blood, which, in case someone doesn't know, is the parameter we use to measure kidney function because it comes from the muscle, reaches the kidney, and 99% of it is filtered. It's not the ideal marker, but it is the universal one.
That's it. It has a few limitations.
Right? It has some little issues, but it's the universal one. Any routine lab panel includes creatinine, but we also have to see if the kidney is letting things escape that it shouldn't, like proteins, right? The famous albumin, which is a specific protein marker that tells us about kidney damage, and measuring it in a routine urine test costs 50 or 60 cents at most.
At most. So with just €1, we can assess our kidneys.
Of course, but why don't we do it, right? We already do it for many conditions.
and the kidneys also have other functions that are much less known, right? For example, is there a connection between the kidney and anemia? Just so people know.
Yes, of course. And besides, the connection with anemia, we've known about this since around the 1990s and we treat it. And that's because erythropoietin is in the kidney, which is what athletes who doped in the 1990s in Spain would inject themselves with, and it actually has a renal origin. Erythropoietin is produced when oxygen is low and signals the bone marrow to make more red blood cells to increase oxygen transport. And this is a normal compensatory mechanism that actually makes perfect sense. For example, training sessions, the preseason ones for teams, right? They go to high altitudes, they go to Bolivia, play a couple of matches, and in a hypoxic environment, they produce more erythropoietin, which raises their hematocrit and allows them, well, when they return to their usual altitude, to perform a little better. The patient with kidney disease doesn't have as much erythropoietin, which is synthesized in the kidney, so it's harder for them to respond to these hypoxic stimuli. As a result, we find ourselves facing a situation of chronic anemia that affects about 95% of patients with advanced chronic kidney disease. For example, in patients with advanced chronic kidney disease, anemia isn't only due to erythropoietin, though that's the main factor. Other causes exist too. For example, patients with chronic kidney disease often have significant iron deficiency, but EPO is the main cause, which is what we treat. Let me tell you an anecdote. Back when I was a resident, the erythropoietin injections were kept in the dialysis unit refrigerators under lock and key. Because people would take them for doping. Yes, well, for whatever reason, but it was real. For whatever reason. So we had to keep them locked up. Now nobody dopes with EPO anymore. Yes, I remember we used to say, "Where's the key to the EPO?" whenever someone needed one.
And it's the treatment that's given to patients when their kidneys don't work, yes?
Yes, totally. I'm telling you, in dialysis, practically 100% of the patients get their dose of erythropoietin every session, adjusted to the hematocrit each one needs. Because not all patients need to have the same hemoglobin and the same hematocrit. It depends on the comorbidities they have, on the physical activity they do. We adjust it. Every month we adjust the erythropoietin for all the patients and it's administered during dialysis, which is convenient. And the patients who come to the clinic inject it themselves. Well, it's a bit like insulin too.
It can be given subcutaneously.
Very easy. Super easy. Yes, really easy.
Another function is to regulate calcium and, let's say, bone dynamics, bone health, right?
Yes. Chronic kidney disease is associated with a disturbance of bone mineral metabolism, and it is associated with this through different mechanisms. The first is phosphorus, of course, which makes perfect sense, right? When phosphorus increases or when we start to retain phosphorus, even if we don't see the increase in lab tests, mechanisms are set in motion. We've already talked a lot about Klotho. We already know that's one of them. The increase in PTH is also set in motion, right? It's also an attempt to rebalance the amount of phosphorus we have. But in addition, the second hydroxylation of vitamin D takes place in the kidney. People might say, what is this man talking about? Well, vitamin D, from the moment we absorb it through sunlight, passes through the liver. And then in the kidney is where it really gets activated after that first hepatic step. If we have kidney disease, this hydroxylation doesn't happen, vitamin D doesn't get activated. And therefore, we have a limitation in the function of vitamin D, especially, for example, in the absorption of calcium through the digestive tract. Consequently, calcium absorption decreases. Kidney disease is linked to low calcium levels. And on top of that, the little calcium that we have in people with kidney disease, since their phosphorus is elevated, it binds together as it's called, and it sticks to the blood vessel. So kidney disease, these bone and mineral disorders are related to low calcium, high phosphorus, and high PTH. And what is the problem with all of this? Well, the bones suffer and become decalcified. In the end, we take out
the calcium from the bones.
We're not providing enough calcium for them to reossify, so to speak. I like to say it's as if the patients had much more osteoporosis. Although that's not the mechanism, it's more complicated, right? Without calcium, ossification is impaired. Plus, since the body knows we're deficient, it takes calcium from the bone.
And from the bone, of course.
Which is bad. So the fact is, sorry to interrupt you, patients on dialysis have about 4 or 5 times higher risk of fractures. And that speaks to their bone health.
Patients are like a ticking time bomb.
Because they have calcium where they shouldn't, that's the problem. Of course, they have it in the blood vessels instead of having it in the bone.
And that's why patients with kidney disease need already active vitamin D, right? Calcitriol. Exactly. instead of giving what we usually give, which is vitamin D3 that needs to be activated. That's right, because the kidney can't activate it.
Exactly. In fact, in the early stages of kidney disease, you can give native vitamin D. Since we're going to monitor calcium, phosphorus, and vitamin D, we can tell whether it's having an effect by monitoring calcium, phosphorus, vitamin D, and PTH. We know if it's having an effect or not, but as the staging of kidney disease progresses, and especially in patients who are on dialysis, it doesn't make sense to give native vitamin D, which we call inactive, and you have to give active vitamin D, because it performs the function directly.
Then, another key function is the regulation of blood pressure, right?
Yes, absolutely.
What does the kidney do to maintain that pressure balance?
Well, a lot of things. In fact, having kidney disease is almost universally associated with having high blood pressure. 80% of patients with kidney disease have high blood pressure, compared to only 30% in the population without kidney disease. That means more than twice, almost 3 times the risk. And that's because, first of all, when the kidney doesn't work, it's basically stopping the elimination of fluids. And since we start to retain fluids, which doesn't necessarily cause swelling or fluid in the lungs, but it does increase pressure inside the blood vessels. This is called volume-dependent hypertension, right? When you have more circulating volume because you can't eliminate it inside a compartment like a blood vessel, which can increase in size a little, it can dilate or contract. But if you increase the content inside the same container, it causes an increase in blood pressure. And that's why many patients need diuretics to eliminate this excess fluid. But also, in the kidney, there are pressure systems. The most well-known is the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which originates in the kidney.
What a mess. To understand it in the
degree program and to say it many times as well, right? But basically what it consists of is that the kidney detects when we have low blood pressure and sets in motion a pressor mechanism to act on the blood vessels to generate an increase in pressure, mainly related to the retention of sodium and water. All of this happens in the kidney. Of course, when we start to lose kidney function, we disrupt this blood pressure control. And then there are other mechanisms that are a bit more complicated, which have to do, for example, with prostaglandins and catecholamines. A patient with kidney disease already faces more complex blood pressure management simply due to the disease. By the way, that's why nephrologists are likely the best specialists for treating high blood pressure, especially resistant hypertension.
And the medications, right?
Of course.
That treat blood pressure. In fact, there are blood pressure medications that benefit the kidney.
Absolutely. For example, those we've mentioned from the aldosterone retention system are classic because of what they do within. In a kidney that is poorly regulating blood pressure, I give it a medication that restores this renal hemodynamics, which is actually the pressure system. In the end, blood reaches the kidney from the heart through a system of very small blood vessels, forming a little bundle of blood vessels called the glomerulus, which is used to a certain pressure. When we develop kidney disease or hypertension, pressure rises, and we begin losing things we shouldn't, like proteins, due to this pressure system. If we restore this hemodynamics, for example, with blockers of this pathway we've mentioned before, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which everyone probably knows, like enalapril or sartans, for example. Well, what these drugs do is lower the blood pressure in the body, lower the blood pressure in the glomerulus, and prevent these proteins from leaking out, which in the long run would have caused kidney failure.
It fails. More pressure, more protein leaks?
Also due to the body's known pressure system.
Of course. Has your specialty seen any exciting pharmaceutical breakthroughs recently? Incredible. I've started using this and patients are improving. People say it like that.
Until now, when someone developed kidney disease, I say this in quotes, of course, but we were hoping they would have a very specific disease so that there would be a very specific treatment we could use to treat it. Of course, many times they were, for example, immunosuppressive drugs for autoimmune diseases and so on, right? But we fell very short with patients who developed kidney disease, which is the majority, for example, due to diabetes, for example, due to hypertension, or for example, due to any disease. But we wanted to have a treatment as a basis to remove these proteins from the kidney, even if it was just due to hemodynamics. Until now, as I said, we only had aldosterone blockers for the renal system. In recent years, several pharmacological groups have been developed that I have seen make an entire audience stand up at an international nephrology congress. Because in 30 years, we hadn't had any progress. And suddenly now we have 4 very powerful drugs, or 4 leading pharmacological groups. The SGLT inhibitors, which are very popular now, right? Yes. What they do is modulate the way the kidney reabsorbs glucose. And that might seem to make no sense in terms of kidney disease progression, but it does. A lot. Because the kidney works with feedback systems that interact, so even if you block one pathway in one part of the kidney, it modulates other parts of the kidney. And so these drugs, for example, we've discovered that they're also able to reduce proteins in the urine. The famous GLP-1 drugs, semaglutide and others from that family. These receptor agonists are also able, beyond diabetes control, beyond obesity control, through direct mechanisms to improve kidney function. And we have clinical trials that prove it. And in fact, our fight is for them to be used just because someone has kidney disease.
Regardless of metabolic disease, but that's interesting. I mean, I understand that there are GLP-1 receptors in the kidney, but how do they work there? I mean, I don't know if you've studied that. Yes, what do they do? Regardless of metabolism and weight?
They are able to modulate the way the kidney retains sodium, and what they do is improve the pressure inside the glomerulus again. In the kidney, we have two compartments. One is the glomerulus, which is the most important in terms of progression, because the other is. They are little tubes called tubules, and what they do is say, oh, I'm letting too much potassium escape, so I'll reabsorb it, too much calcium, so I'll eliminate it, right? But they don't have as much impact on progression as the glomerulus, which, when it either stops filtering because the small vessels are damaged, the kidney disease progresses, or it starts letting proteins escape into the urine. Why are we so focused on proteins in urine? Because we know that with the same glomerular filtration rate, with the same kidney function, the more proteins we let escape, the greater the progression of kidney disease. That's why we're so obsessed with modulating the hemodynamics inside the glomerulus. So, both blockers of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, as well as GLP-1 receptor agonists and SGLT2 inhibitors, are able to limit this pressure inside the glomerulus. So they help keep those proteins from leaking out because they are toxic to the kidney and drive progression.
Great, so they all work more or less with a similar purpose.
Yes, what happens is that the effect is completely exponential and additive. It's additive. Absolutely. In fact, we use them, for example, the blockers of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system that are used for high blood pressure. And before we used to say, well, if the patient has proteinuria, loses proteins and has high blood pressure, we use this. Now, what we do is, even if they don't have high blood pressure, we give them any of these drugs, yes, making sure that the patient doesn't suddenly get hypotensive and collapse, right? We increase the dose to the patient's maximum tolerance because regardless of high blood pressure, diabetes, or metabolic disorders, it directly protects the kidney.
Interesting. In the book, you also mention stories like that of the late Maria Brañas, right? Oh, yes.
Sí.
Who, well, was a centenarian who, I don't know, reached 116, 117.
Yes, 117.
117, truly amazing.
At 117 with a mind that's incredible. Of course, because I saw some videos of him and, well, I think he's in better shape than I am, you know? I mean, he's someone who lives a normal, active life.
What can we learn from people like Maria?
Well, wow, a lot of things. In fact, I really liked how her very unique case has been researched, because I think it was done from a very holistic point of view. We haven't just focused on her habits, what this woman did, or what medications she took, but instead, they've approached it from every angle. And the work has even been published in high-impact journals. First of all, genetic makeup matters. How much does it matter? Well, the experts on this say about 30%. I think they say 30 because we still don't know a lot about genetics. Yes.
A study was published in Science earlier this year that said it was a little more than that, almost half, especially when we're talking about extreme longevity. For example, in Maria's case, it would be...
In her case, for example, she had a really cool alteration in how she managed her LDL receptor cholesterol. So genetically, she had a perfect lipid metabolism. I mean, this woman probably didn't have a single atheroma plaque. Of course. Did diet have an impact? Yes, of course it did. In fact, I really like it because in all the papers that have been published, they mention that she ate a yogurt every day of her life. A yogurt. A yogurt to restore the microbiota, all natural, every day of her life for about 60 years, right? But anyway, I think that, of course, we've learned that everything together adds up, right? So, if you don't have very favorable genetics, well, we can also think about epigenetics, which in the end is the way our genetic code impacts our health, but assuming that there are things that can be changed. So we don't have to settle for, well, since I have a family history of shorter lifespans, I just let it be. No, epigenetics is also very important, right?
Yes, absolutely. And the way you live, right? In the end, that's also epigenetics, and sometimes you can't follow it. For example, Maria's lifestyle, I think she was from Galicia. She was Galician, right? From a village in Galicia. I think it can't really be done maybe in Madrid, in the city center, where you might know it's impossible. So the whole ecosystem, it's not just the person and their genetics, which of course contributes, but also the ecosystem in which that life takes place, right? Emotional connections, the way of living, the pace of life, all of that, I think, is ultimately what creates those blue zones in addition to genetics.
Yes, and by the way, in Galicia, they're about to establish the 6th blue zone on the planet.
We're going to have it close by, yes.
That's great. Honestly, that makes me happy because I was wondering why in Spain we have such healthy habits.
How can we not? Life expectancy is the second highest.
Of course, it's incredible that there isn't a population center. You know, in the end, that's a rule about the number of centenarians compared to the average in the United States. And well, maybe that's a bit arbitrary when it comes to establishing the blue zones, right? But of course, yes, we already know that there are a lot of habits that directly impact our genetic code. So we shouldn't just settle for saying, oh, I have bad genetics, right?
There's a phrase in the book I read that caught my attention, especially since we're discussing older people. It said something like home care was far superior in studies compared to care in nursing homes for our elderly people. I mean, do you really think that as a society we're not properly taking care of our elderly people?
Well, I have no doubt that we're not taking good care of them, and the concept of loneliness, I think, beyond the sadness it may cause us emotionally, has an impact on people's health. And in fact, in the blue zones of the planet, one thing I've always wondered about, or that all the studies on their habits question, is that in most of them a common factor appeared, which was having a glass of wine. I think that's why people thought it was healthy, but we now know it's not. But my question about this is, how much of a confounding factor is this glass of wine when it comes to socializing? And what is the impact of this socialization? In fact, people often ask me, can I have a glass of wine? Well, no. As a doctor, I tell you no, but if this is going to be the only way you get together with your friends or go play a game or whatever you do, and it makes you, for example, go up a little hill, then maybe yes, right? Of course. Well, that's where this comes from. There's a really interesting study that, well, interesting, right? Not because of the conclusions, but due to its design. I believe it's a doctoral thesis from the University of Seville that discussed this, right? About the factors involved in why in nursing homes the mortality rate was 55%. I think that's the number 55, higher than under the same conditions with home care. And it had to do, there's no other way, with the care given to people and probably also with the slight slowing of cognitive decline that social relationships provide.
And you see this in hospitals, right? When you have to discharge an elderly person, you already look at what kind of social support they have. You also see if it's more or less difficult to discharge them because yes, it's done, you can see it, and sometimes it's a real problem, right? Yes.
It's a real problem. It's a shame when, for example, the Friday before Easter arrives and suddenly there are 3 or 4 people, right? Some elderly people are left in the emergency room to spend Easter there because their families don't want to take care of them and because the Carroll family has to go on a trip, right? This didn't happen 30 years ago. Well, I remember, my grandparents and their parents always took care of their relatives. The whole nursing home thing is, in quotes, a business. Well, actually, no quotes. It's a current business that generates millions of euros a year because we've stopped taking care of our relatives. We have so many things to do in life, So we can't take care of our family members. What a shame, right? That's it. That's why I wanted to reflect on that in the book, because I also deliberately looked for an article that proved what I was already saying, kind of to raise the alarm, like, okay, yes, it's more comfortable, but be careful about what this is causing you, right? And I think, look, also on the level of the caregiver or the non-caregiver, the one who doesn't want to be a caregiver, it also has consequences throughout their life. At some point, they regret having done it.
Yeah, I mean, do you think so too? I think so. Whether someone gives care or doesn't give care, it also impacts their...
I think that if you see your relative, your mother, for example, dying in a nursing home in a bad way, by bad way, I mean those deaths in nursing homes that sometimes happen, where they call you from one day to the next and say, well, she passed away. And you're like, but from what? It's just that maybe you don't even know, right? And those last moments, I think they take a toll. In fact, we see it a lot in the hospital, right? When a patient is about to pass away, we already know, we notify the family because they're in very bad shape. There's a lot of obsession, and I think it's an obsession that's actually beautiful and good from certain families. They don't want to leave the room in case the patient passes away at a moment when they're not there, in case they don't notice. I think it has to do with the guilt they might feel, but you only feel guilty in those situations if you've been the caregiver.
Of course, of course.
This has nothing to do with the kidneys, what I just told you.
But it's fine. In the end, it's about medicine, society, and humanization, and how the priorities we're giving to relationships compared to other things like work. Obviously, I think that anyone who leaves their family member in a nursing home has a reason. It's not always going to be the selfish act of, I don't want to take care of them myself. It's probably more like, I have 3 kids, I have a very demanding job, and I just can't do it all. But in the end, it does say something about the priority we're giving to caring for our loved ones, doesn't it? Yes. Because children, obviously, well, there are also people who let others raise their kids, right? But people are much more aware when it comes to taking care of children. But in the end, the elderly, the extremes of life require care. And you have to give it to both ends of life, the very young and the very old. But perfect.
Why are we so demanding of ourselves, for example, with work, but not with care? It's something that's hard for me to understand too, you know?
Because I think society leads us to that, right? To prioritize consuming and producing, which are 2 sides of the same coin.
Then it's true that you find yourself, for example, here in Malaga or in Madrid, and you try to buy an apartment and you say, well, okay, I'm going to try to work a little less and so on, but I can't buy it. No. Because of course, I don't have money for that, right?
It's a vicious circle.
I don't blame anyone for putting a relative in a nursing home, but with the facts, you need to understand what that means.
Of course. Getting into frequently asked questions about kidneys, which people always ask in the comments, the first episode was full of them, right? For example, can we die from drinking too much water theoretically?
Theoretically, yes. Unfortunately, we also know this in practice, right? One of the functions of the kidney is to concentrate and dilute urine, and we know that. When I got up this morning, my first urination was very dark, of course, very concentrated, very yellow, full of urea. Why is that? I haven't drunk anything overnight, and the kidneys can concentrate. Up to what limit? More or less up to half a liter per day. That's as concentrated as the kidney can make urine, meaning it's about the minimum amount we need to urinate to eliminate the toxins produced in our daily life.
No matter what day it is, we have to urinate half a liter.
We have to urinate. Drinking half a liter means we actually have to drink much more because we lose water through perspiration, sweat, and breathing. We should aim to drink about 1.5 liters daily. This includes not just water, but also water from fruit, soups, coffee, and similar sources, right? There's also an extreme on the other side. Well, that also happens because the kidney has a limited capacity to dilute urine, and when it can't anymore, it starts to accumulate that water inside the blood vessels. And it creates an imbalance with the rest of the kidneys, especially with sodium, and hyponatremia occurs. What is this limit? 20 liters. That's a huge amount. We have seen it, for example, we have seen it published in the scientific literature about a hazing that took place in the United States with an 18-year-old guy when he started college. They made him drink gallons throughout the day, and a gallon is 5 liters. By the 4th gallon, he collapsed and died. He likely had cerebral edema and collapsed immediately. And he collapsed. He must have died. So that's the limit where the kidney starts to accumulate water. But I've had patients who have certain illnesses, for example, and who drink 8, 9, even 10 liters a day. And this is not something that's recommended, not at all, but if you have, let's say, portomania, for example, they don't die. You know? I mean, it's very hard to reach those 20.
Yeah, I don't know if I saw something published about ultra-endurance athletes who overhydrated in an extreme way. It's exaggerated, yes, but well, it must be something very rare and very hard to reach that point. Of course, the body's own thirst and satiety mechanisms, right? Yeah.
Drinking 20 liters is very difficult, especially when dehydrated and your kidneys have reduced perfusion, affecting concentration and dilution. If you subject your kidneys to continuous dehydration, even if that doesn't show up in lab tests, they still lose their ability. In fact, one of the first functions the kidney loses is the ability to concentrate urine. So, I'm talking about extremely healthy people who could even drink up to 20 liters, right? If you're experiencing dehydration, it's probably less because that kidney is functioning worse.
Yes. Another common question, Borja Bandera, is, well, I went to urinate this morning and there was a lot of foam. Is that normal? Should I be worried?
Well, look, you only need to worry if you're not a hypochondriac, because when we urinate, there's always a little bit of foam, and that's completely normal, even if it's just because of the gravity of the stream falling, okay? When should I be worried? Well, I should be worried in the sense that I should go get a urine test done. That's the concern. I mean, in 24 hours, the concern is resolved. When a lot of foam is produced, and this is because we're losing proteins that have negative charges, and this foam doesn't go away. It doesn't disappear after 5 or 10 minutes. There are a lot of people who always like to compare it, for example, to a well-poured beer. Or people who tell me, for example, it's true, I clean the toilet on Mondays, but by Wednesday it still looks like I just used cleaning product, right? That foam is still there. Is this something to be alarmed about? Yes, but almost on the same day. You can even go to the pharmacy, buy a test strip, dip it in the urine and see if it shows protein or not, and that would help us rule it out. So let's say yes, mainly to raise awareness. Usually people don't notice this until you ask if they're losing protein in their urine after a checkup. They say, didn't you have more foam in your urine? Wow, that's true. And that's when they realize.
Yeah, I also remember that there were some cleaning products that could create foam, which led to overdiagnosis. I mean, people would get really worried.
It's actually a very bad screening test, but it's useful so we don't miss any cases.
All right, I bet you get hypochondriac patients, right? Like, I saw foam in my urine, what's wrong with me?
Some people have even included their period in the pattern
To measure it.
Then I went from 1 to 1.5 centimeters and asked, please don't put the ruler in the pattern.
Oh, the ruler's kind of gross.
So, well, there's a bit of everything, of course. That's why I said I'm a hypochondriac.
We've talked about this a lot, but people keep asking what the symptoms are if my kidneys are not doing well. So what's the most important thing? I know you're going to tell me a urine test, measuring creatinine, measuring proteins.
The thing is, the most common symptom of kidney disease is having no symptoms. None at all. You can develop kidney disease and often don't notice it until your kidneys stop working. When it's below 15%, when the filtration rate is below 15%, you may start having symptoms. Because on top of that, kidney disease is a bit peculiar in this regard. It starts causing some changes that are so subtle, for example, typical symptoms of advanced kidney disease like tiredness and fatigue, nausea and vomiting, loss of appetite, itching. These are symptoms that go so unnoticed, especially if they develop very slowly, that it's very difficult for the patient to realize. Well, a very important one, for example, is if your legs suddenly swell, right? That could be due to kidney disease or other things, right? That can be more noticeable when you suddenly can't fit into shoes you used to wear, right? But the rest of the symptoms, since they develop very slowly, don't really stand out. Your blood pressure might go up a little, for example. But like I said, it's difficult.
Why does it itch? Why is there itching?
Because uremic toxins build up. Uremic toxins are one of the things that the kidney has to filter out, and they are basically high molecular weight proteins to which the urea, which we are no longer filtering, attaches. And that causes reactions at many levels.
It's logical. It doesn't cause spikes of itching.
The receptors, for example, for itching, it's an itch that's very hard to get rid of. In fact, now we have a drug that has been developed called diphenhydramine, which is very complicated to say, and it was in the New England Journal about 4 or 5 years ago, where it was shown to be the first effective treatment for resistant pruritus in dialysis patients, which is something.
It must be exasperating, right?
Well, you don't know what I've seen. I mean, some brutal excoriations all over, but patients who come in bleeding, you know? Because of course, in the end, there's a risk of infection with that, totally. On top of that, there are the nerve issues, since they usually have very dry skin, precisely because of these uremic toxins. Right? So, that makes it even harder to relieve it in any way, not even with cream.
Yes, that very thin paper-like skin, right? Sometimes it gets bruised and all that, yes.
Which is very characteristic of people with kidney disease.
People also want to know if there are natural products that can be used or that are good for the kidneys. I think what people usually take are diuretic teas, right? And things like that.
And in fact, those are dangerous because you can't take a diuretic if you don't need it. In the end...
Like horsetail, right?
Horsetail, for example, we've seen it, right? In clinic, patients come in dehydrated because they're taking horsetail since they say they're bloated, that they're retaining fluids. When someone's retaining fluid, there are 2 or 3 conditions you can easily rule out. Having a slightly swollen ankle doesn't necessarily mean we're retaining fluid. But if we take horsetail, for example, or a diuretic, for example, when we don't need to, in the end, our whole hemodynamic system will suffer because our blood pressure will drop and the kidneys will become dehydrated. And it's going to be dangerous. There are no natural products that cure anything related to the kidneys because if there were, everyone would be taking them. I'm the first one interested in having a magic supplement that would prevent us from developing any kidney disease. But the natural thing we can do is have a balanced diet, for example, which is natural and does provide benefits for kidney health.
Another question, Borja Bandera, is if I'm pretty strong, have a lot of muscle mass, and my creatinine levels are high, do I need to assess my kidney function in a different way?
Without a doubt, absolutely. And this is one of the problems we encounter with creatinine. The normal plasma creatinine value is between 0.8 and 1.2 according to laboratory ranges. If it's below or above that range, you'll see an asterisk, but if we have a person who is very strong, very muscular, they're producing more creatinine, and we've already said that it comes directly from the muscle. It reaches the kidney, and the kidney can filter 99% without any problem. But since more is being produced in the plasma, we see a higher result. So yes, when we come across an abnormality, when it comes to kidney function, there is a problem here, and it's that we can even find patients who are within the renal function range, but for example, they are very cachectic, they have almost no muscle, and they have kidney disease, and the lab results don't have the asterisk, right? So, we have to know how to interpret creatinine and glomerular filtration rate, just so people know. It's putting creatinine into a formula based on age, sex, and race. And it tells us, well, we estimate your kidney is functioning this way, but in uncertain cases, we have two options from routine clinical practice that are already used everywhere. The first is to do a 24-hour creatinine clearance. What is this? Measure the urine over 24 hours to know how much creatinine we're actually eliminating and compare it with the creatinine in the plasma. For example, someone who exercises a lot and has more muscle mass will excrete much more creatinine, even if their plasma levels are slightly higher. Another way is to use parameters unrelated to muscle mass, which are independent, like a currently popular method already recommended by guidelines. We already order cystatin C for practically all patients. So what do we normally do? What do the guidelines recommend? The guidelines recommend measuring creatinine. If you have no doubts, it's a simple and easy parameter. You can measure it as many times as you want, and it tells you how the kidney is doing. If we have even the slightest doubt, we order cystatin. And in fact, the best measurement nowadays in clinical practice, not in clinical trials where there are other methods, is to do creatinine and cystatin and take an average of the two to obtain the glomerular filtration rate.
Both are used to get an average.
In fact, the current recommended formula for glomerular filtration rate by CKD is creatinine and cystatin.
And what other things can raise creatinine that don't mean a decrease in glomerular filtration rate?
Those that have to do with what creatinine does, with the processes that creatinine goes through in the kidney, mainly. There are certain medications, for example, and also certain diets, for example, those high in protein, especially if the proteins are cooked, that can modify either the measurement or the processes that creatinine undergoes. What are these processes? When we filter creatinine, it passes through the glomerulus, as we've mentioned, the capillary tuft, and goes to the tubule, let's say the pipes, that will eventually lead to urine through the bladder. Creatinine undergoes some processes there that we already know about and that we take into account in the estimation formulas, which are secretion and excretion. That is, it's as if it is reabsorbed and then excreted again. Well, if some drug, for example, some antibiotic comes to mind, if it makes us reabsorb more creatinine in these little tubes we have in the kidney, it could give us a false idea that the creatinine is higher and therefore that the kidney is working worse. So that's something we also have to keep in mind, the drugs that affect kidney function or how creatinine is measured, so we can understand what we're actually measuring.
Also creatine supplementation, I assume.
Well, without a doubt, of course, I just mentioned it briefly, but creatine is a precursor of creatinine, that's why it's used for muscle mass development. And obviously, if we take creatine, and we estimate the glomerular filtration rate with creatinine, we need to inform the person reviewing the blood test that it will likely be elevated. There are many nephrologists who have demonized creatine for a long time because it was thought to be toxic, when in fact it's not toxic at all. But you have to understand how creatinine is measured in people who take creatine supplements. Since so many people take it, all of us nephrologists have gotten used to it. By the way, the increase in creatinine in people who take creatine is very minimal. We're talking about between 0.1 and 0.3, of course. For example, I take creatine myself, as I've mentioned before, and my creatinine levels remain normal. It's true that I'm not a particularly muscular person, not at all, but my plasma creatinine is 1 and it used to be 0.8, 0.9. Okay. So
a disproportionate increase.
No, but it's true that there are people, well, like that, who have a lot of muscle mass and take creatine, and it's fine. We just do a 24-hour clearance and that's it. The problem is that there were many who were labeled as having kidney disease.
Of course, that's serious. Just imagine. Well, yes. Imagine the anxiety it can cause the patient, right? Of course. All right, another interesting question. Could it reveal a kidney disease? Well, actually, could the kidney reveal an eating disorder?
Wow, that's a good one because yes, we are what we eat and what we drink. So, of course, eating disorders, especially those that involve repeated vomiting, not only make us get rid of the food we're eating, but we also lose other things that are in our stomach, like, for example, chloride. Chloride, the stomach is full of hydrochloric acid precisely to achieve a low pH that allows the digestion of certain foods. So, in chronic vomiters, we see that there is a very significant chloride depletion. The kidney stops excreting the chloride it would normally excrete, and we notice that. Another way we can see this is that many of these patients, most of them, about 90% are women, as you know, take diuretics secretly, meaning without anyone knowing. We can see through the urine biochemistry how we are eliminating sodium, potassium, and chloride. And if it matches with what that person has in their plasma, in their blood, and especially with the foods they eat or the medications they take. Also, not only that, besides measuring that, I find a person who is very thin and, for example, is very hypotensive with very low potassium in their plasma. If I notice they're excreting a lot of sodium, potassium, and chloride when they shouldn't, that's unusual. For example, with low plasma potassium, the kidney tries to reabsorb as much as possible. Well, I label it and I can confirm it because traces of diuretics can be measured in the urine. I mean, we can analyze whether that patient has taken diuretics or not. Of course, we've diagnosed a lot, yes? Well, a lot. And well,
talk to the endocrinologist and see what happens, right?
Endocrinologist, psychiatry, of course. And it's a diagnosis that often, well, not always, but in many cases leads to a cure. Of course, you got it.
Of course. If you had to tell a patient with chronic kidney disease just one essential habit to follow, what would it be? To avoid ending up on dialysis, obviously there are many things, but if you had to tell them, Manolo, to avoid dialysis, the most important thing is...
The thing is, it's just that choosing only one habit is very difficult, isn't it? Because I would separate, on one hand, controlling cardiovascular risk factors, controlling blood pressure, sugar, and cholesterol as general points, and then at least diet and muscle. At least. And with that, we slow down the progression. Okay? For sure. Great. You can do more things, but if you want a direct message, that's it.
Okay. We talked earlier about connections and crosstalks. What relationship had you found between the microbiota and kidney health, or between digestive health and kidney health?
People with kidney disease, especially related to uremic toxins and inflammation, directly modify the microbiota. So the microbiota of people with kidney disease is altered. Sometimes we find that 100% of the strains they have are bad.
No, yes.
Yes. In patients with severe kidney disease.
A prebiotic treatment is considered, or well, yes.
More so with prebiotics, particularly when included in clinical trials. Yes. In those where they can start to be given, well, yes, prebiotics, for example. You may know that fecal transplantation is becoming popular now, especially for treating Clostridium-resistant infections. Also, and there are some clinical trials in that regard. I'm not even talking about people who take, for example, immunosuppressants. Transplant patients or those on dialysis with non-functioning kidneys and vice versa experience microbiota changes. Because of these nasty reactions that occur in the digestive tract, they generate a lot of free radicals, a strong pro-inflammatory response, which is very bad for the kidney because kidney disease is already inflammatory by nature, and this leads to increased progression.
Yes. Speaking about the relationship between the heart and the kidneys. It exists. I remember something about cardiorenal syndrome, right? If that's it, tell us about it.
Which is still a hot topic, right? What this talks about is organs that are connected by blood vessels, and when one fails, the other fails too. If the heart fails, the typical cardiorenal syndromes, for example, we have a pump problem, it pumps less. The one that gets less blood is the kidney, which should be getting 2,000 liters of blood a day, but it gets it with less force, and so the kidney ends up getting damaged. It's like we're dehydrating it a little, right? Every day. This happens acutely. If I have an acute myocardial infarction and it stops working, the kidney stops working, but also chronically if my heart is getting damaged over time. But it could also be because I have a valve that's not working properly, right? Because the ventricle works worse for any reason and less blood arrives. And the opposite also happens when the kidney starts to fail, it begins to accumulate, for example, this excess fluid. And that means the heart has to fight against more resistance to pump that blood. In the end, an organ that is actually a muscle needs more strength to pump the blood. It ends up causing what we call abnormal remodeling, right? The walls get thicker, the chambers become smaller, and then it pumps less blood. Well, this is what's known as the cardiorenal syndrome, which has always been quite well known, but now it has led us to create a very interesting care model, which are the cardiorenal units. Because there are medications that both cardiologists and nephrologists use, some of which we mentioned earlier, for example, that are beneficial for both organs, so we can prescribe and adjust them together. In one appointment, besides doing an ultrasound and echocardiogram during the consultation, we can also measure body composition with bioimpedance. These appointments take time, but they combine 2 consultations into one, greatly benefiting the patient. Spain is now a pioneer in cardiorenal units. We are the country in the world with the most cardiorenal units and with the best results to date because we have seen that it reduces, for example, the number of hospitalizations, which is already significant.
Of course, super interesting. Another question I always had was why the kidney has so many autoimmune diseases. I mean, it has a lot, right? At least when I was studying, yes.
It has its own, which are the famous glomerulonephritis, which were always hard for us to learn when we were studying, but in addition, it is greatly affected by any immunological disease, for example, lupus being the main one, or vasculitis affecting the kidney. And that's because when we have an immunological disease, what happens to our defenses is that they form an abnormal complex between the aggressor, the antigen, and the defense, an immunoglobulin, for example. These complexes are almost always soluble. Almost always, I mean in a normal situation we could say, and they are eliminated by the kidney. If you get sick, immune complexes are eliminated through the kidneys. In autoimmune diseases, defenses form incorrectly and attack things they shouldn't. And then they become insoluble. And then what happens is that they get stuck in the first filter we have in the body, which is the kidney, the glomerulus, which is the kidney's filter. They get deposited there and then form the well-known glomerulonephritis, which just means inflammation of the glomerulus. It could also be called glomerulitis, but it's called glomerulonephritis because it's the kidney's glomerulus even though there aren't other glomeruli.
It's an immunological victim of the kidney because it's the filter that gets clogged and everything. Exactly. Wow, that's interesting. And also, a diseased kidney accelerates the loss of muscle and bone. We know that, but why? By what mechanisms?
For a lot of reasons, for a lot. To begin with, because we've said that patients with kidney disease eat very poorly, they're generally malnourished. Also, because uremic toxins create an inflammatory environment that triggers sarcopenia. And also, because of epiphenomena related to kidney disease, such as, for example, metabolic acidosis, which causes a very bad imbalance between protein synthesis and degradation, mainly favoring the hydrolysis of these proteins. What kind of degradation? These proteins that are lost then stop forming these very beneficial bonds at the muscular level. It's multifactorial. There are also drugs that are used and that also impact all these pathways, of course.
Then, without the metabolic aspect, as we were saying,
the epiphenomenon of metabolic acidosis, which causes accelerated protein degradation, and therefore we don't have those bridges, right, to support the muscle. It's multifactorial, but it's very evident.
So a patient with damaged kidneys definitely has to take care of their muscles.
Absolutely. In fact, during dialysis sessions, patients in the hospital do physical therapy throughout the 4-hour session. We have weights, we have pedals, so that at least...
I hadn't considered that. Yeah, it's 3 or 4 hours, right? Of course.
They're wasting their time.
They can use that time to train.
Yes. They do, actually. That's great.
That's great. Good. There's also another important area in your specialty, which is medications. You use a lot of medications that protect the kidney and stop or slow down, or rather slow the progression of the disease. But there are many others we all use that harm the kidney and are the nephrologist's enemies, right? Yes. Let's review them. I think people need to understand the issue with NSAIDs and why NSAIDs damage the kidney. That needs to be very clear because it's also...
the anti-inflammatories, the problem they have, and we're talking about any type of anti-inflammatory, ibuprofen, enantium, is that they can damage the kidney in many ways, up to 5, in 5 different ways. 5 pathophysiological mechanisms that, of course, I can't go into detail about now because some are very complicated, but basically I want to highlight 2. One is that anti-inflammatories are capable of directly killing the tubular cells, which are the little cells we've mentioned that line all these final tubes.
Okay.
This, which is called acute tubular necrosis, is caused directly by anti-inflammatories. They can also damage other compartments, right? Yes.
Immunological mechanism or what?
Direct injury due to accumulation? Yes. The tubular cell reabsorbs it and destroys it. But also, as we mentioned earlier about renal hemodynamics, the hemodynamics, that is, the glomerulus contracts or dilates depending on blood pressure. That's where regulation comes in, especially blocking the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. We've discussed this pathway, right? Well, the outflow of blood from the glomerulus through the glomerular side is regulated by a pathway related to the mechanism of action of NSAIDs, which are the prostaglandins. When we take NSAIDs, we inhibit prostaglandins, some prostaglandins. Well, one of them is responsible for regulating the outflow pressure of the glomerulus. So imagine that we open the outlet hose through which blood leaves the kidney. Well, then what happens inside the glomerulus is that the blood pressure drops a lot. Of course, because obviously you're creating an outlet. Imagine a hose that you suddenly open. which means we're preventing normal filtration from happening. So, two very clear reasons to stop taking NSAIDs, especially in large amounts, right? These people who say, no, I take an ibuprofen every day just in case something hurts? Wrong. It's a different thing if one day you have a toothache and you take an ibuprofen. Obviously you can, there's no problem.
Right? Also diuretics when misused, right? No doubt. Dangerous for the kidneys.
Of course, and we've seen it many times, right? But also sometimes it's our fault. We come across patients, for example, who have heart failure. They start being treated with diuretics. They go home and suddenly start a low-salt diet, drink a little less, it's hotter, and they get dehydrated. They keep taking the same amount of diuretics, and the kidney, of course, is left without perfusion. It doesn't get enough blood, and then there's a deterioration in kidney function. That's why it's very important to teach patients to manage their own diuretics. And I won't even mention those who take them just because they want to. That's terrible. That makes no sense at all. But especially for patients who take diuretics, you have to explain to them, for example, if your blood pressure suddenly drops a lot, or if you suddenly lose a lot of weight from one day to the next, that's not because you're losing fat, that's because you're losing fluid, right? Of course, if my patients suddenly run a marathon, they can't take a diuretic that day.
Of course, I mean, your patients do know more or less how to manage diuretics.
They know, and we explain to those who don't. We have strong nursing support for this, especially in the advanced chronic kidney disease clinics I mentioned. Each visit, patients see the doctor, then nursing, followed by nutrition. And together, we explain to the patient that they have to weigh themselves every day, check their blood pressure every day, and check the weather every day.
Yes, it's a disease that requires a lot of education.
And careful management.
A very dynamic management, right? Yes. It's very much day-to-day depending on different situations because in the end, since the kidney is always maintaining the body's homeostasis, right? Yes.
I can't just say, take 2 furosemide tablets and see you in 6 months.
No.
And everything that happens in between.
Of course. You know, that's interesting. Do PPIs, proton pump inhibitors, have any interaction?
It's a drug that's been used a bit too casually, in my opinion. Who doesn't take an omeprazole every now and then? I don't think there's much of a problem with that. But yes, many patients are prescribed omeprazole, for example, just because they take a lot of pills so it doesn't hurt their stomach. Omeprazole isn't meant for that. Omeprazole regulates stomach pH and should only be used when truly indicated, such as for gastritis, hiatal hernia, or other conditions as prescribed by a gastroenterologist or knowledgeable family doctor. Omeprazole is prescribed casually, as if it has no side effects, but it does. It's taken too lightly. One side effect that's getting a lot of attention lately is that it causes magnesium deficiency, which is pretty significant and we see it often. Another is that it can damage the kidneys due to direct toxicity as well. Also, when it's direct toxicity, that's a slightly different matter. We have the small tubes we've mentioned called tubules. Those tubules lead to a space called the interstitium. This interstitium is actually a reflection of what's happening in the blood, and that's why, through these little cells in the tubule, the transport mechanisms occur from what will become urine into the blood. Well, this role that the interstitium plays gets damaged, for example, by PPIs like omeprazole, pantoprazole, and others when taken chronically.
2 independent doses, I imagine that's when you take a lot.
And especially after a consumption period of more than 6 weeks.
More than 6 weeks. Well, there are patients who take them every day for years of their lives, some for 15 years. Yes, incredible. Then there are some antibiotics called aminoglycosides, a family. What do these do to the kidney?
These do what we mentioned before, what anti-inflammatories do to the tubular cells. That's what aminoglycosides do. For example, gentamicin causes direct injury by acute tubular necrosis of the tubular cells. It's dose-dependent, and as it passes through the glomerulus, what happens with all these drugs is that they go through the glomerulus and end up in the tubule. That tubule is lined. They're like little boats floating in urine. When they find the receptor on the tubular cell, they're internalized and damage the cells.
And they die.
That's why it's very important with these drugs, because in most cases the doses can be adjusted, and they can be adjusted based on the concentration we have in the blood. So there are very few drugs that need that. Most people are likely familiar with lithium. We can measure lithium levels in the blood to adjust the dose. Well, aminoglycosides, for example, can also have their concentration adjusted based on what we have in the blood.
Or use the extended therapeutic dose, ensuring it's as minimally nephrotoxic as possible.
Right, because it really depends on your kidney function. They say you can't take aminoglycosides if you have kidney disease. Yes, you can, but remember you have kidney disease and likely need a lower dose. Measuring your blood concentration is the best way to confirm.
Another precaution Many times when we're going to have an imaging test, an MRI, or any other, we have to inject iodinated contrast agents into the circulatory system, right? What do they do in the kidney?
Iodinated contrast agents have greatly improved in recent years. Before, there were some that were more toxic, which depended on their osmolarity, which, to put it another way, is the concentration of iodine they had. And now actually the new ones that are available are much safer. This means that we hardly ever limit the use of iodinated contrast agents for almost anyone. But it's a problem of concentration, again in the same region, because almost all the mechanisms of toxicity are usually related to the same region of the tubule. It's very rare for there to be a glomerular toxicity mechanism because in the end, if there were a glomerular one, it would be in the vessel part, which is the glomerulus. So it would practically be present throughout the whole body, right? So it really depends on the concentration we have. Like I said, with these new ones, we see very little contrast-induced nephropathy, which is what it's called, right? Or contrast-associated acute kidney injury, which is the new term. So what do we need to make sure of? Well, that the patient is not dehydrated. This is vital. When a patient is going to be given an iodinated contrast, they cannot be dehydrated. And for that, sometimes what we do is adjust a little bit the medications that patients take before the contrast. They take a furosemide tablet, we check them, they're fine, so we advise not to take it for the next 3 days. Or skip blood pressure medications if they're doing reasonably well. Or don't take metformin, because metformin, for example, can increase the risk we have of acute kidney injury.
That was the last question I was going to ask you. There are some, in my specialty, some anti-diabetic drugs that below a certain filtration threshold can be contraindicated or not recommended. And why is that? I mean, for metformin below a filtration rate of 30, that is yes?
Yes. Anti-diabetics, almost all of them, have to be adjusted depending on how the kidney works, on the amount of kidney disease we have. In fact, when it drops below 30, we find quite a few difficulties using anti-diabetics, and sometimes we have to switch to insulin to be able to treat diabetes. And above all, it has a lot to do with the amount of drug that accumulates. For example, with metformin, it's not so much the direct damage it can do to the kidney, but rather the generation of this well-known lactic acidosis, which is so dangerous and can occur when we reach excessively high levels of metformin. Even in patients who don't have kidney disease and, for example, develop diarrhea, which is a side effect of metformin.
Dehydration isn't due to metformin damaging the kidney, but because it builds up when the kidney isn't working well. As an organic acid, it can create lactic acid and cause acidosis.
Acidosis láctica
But also sulfonylurea, also GLP-1 even with low filtration rates, right? Yes.
We are using them universally.
Even with very low filtration rates now.
Even dialysis.
Even dialysis, yes.
That's great. It also creates a huge benefit. For example, when a patient is on dialysis, the goal is to get them on the kidney transplant waiting list. Having a BMI over 30, I know you can't really say it like that because BMI has its limitations, obviously, but in general, it makes us think that maybe the patient needs to lose weight, because if we transplant a patient who is obese, the risk of things going worse is higher. Previously, it was impossible for many patients to lose weight, but now GLP-1 lets us add them to the waiting list.
Also, just like with bariatric surgery, it's a criterion that the patient doesn't have severe obesity in order to be put on the transplant list. The same. Yes, it's a criterion. Yes.
Yes. But of course, with these drugs, in 6 months, we can include them, right? And then, the SGLT2 inhibitors, the new drugs we were talking about, it's true that they have a filtration limitation down to 20. In the end, not all drugs that affect renal hemodynamics do so in the same way. In me, who has a healthy kidney, a healthy glomerulus, and the blood vessels can self-regulate. If you have very little healthy kidney left, it may affect hemodynamics, so it can't regulate itself properly. SGLT2s shouldn't be started when filtration rates are under 10, but if they're already in use, they can be continued until the rate reaches 10, which is essentially the start of dialysis.
On average, how long does a patient who starts dialysis wait before getting a transplant?
It mainly depends on the blood group, because normally transplants are done with compatible blood groups, although in some exceptions they might not, and it especially depends on whether the transplant is from a living donor or a deceased donor. If it's from a living donor, many patients don't even need to start dialysis because a relative, since it has to be a related person in Spain due to specific legislation, can donate. It's not in every case, but almost always yes.
By transplanted, we mean it could be your brother, for example.
Your cousin, your uncle. I mean, it can be a second-degree relative. Sometimes dialysis isn't even needed. We're increasingly relying on this. You can live well with just one kidney. If it's from a deceased donor, it depends on blood type. But in Spain, the average wait is 2 to 3 years.
Some followers with only one kidney have asked me this between 2 and 3 years. if they can take supplements, if they can train at a certain intensity, if they can do this or that. What limitations does a patient with one kidney have? None. None? None. I mean, the human body is designed to live with one kidney as well.
Totally. That's pretty remarkable. Of course, what this kidney does is more or less my kidneys. I'm about 1.85 meters tall, so they're about 12 centimeters each, right? Kidney size clearly depends somewhat on the body, right? If they removed one of my kidneys now for any reason, or if I donated it, for example, what the other kidney does is hypertrophy, and it can reach about 14 centimeters approximately. That's to maintain functionality. The kidney is such an important organ that, in fact, we are lucky to have two because evolution has given us two precisely to maintain their functions even in the absence of one. And there are very long-term studies, over 30 years published in the New England Journal, not just any journal, about people who have donated a kidney. And on top of that, donors from 30 years ago, which is not the same as now. Nowadays, of course, we are super selective when it comes to choosing which patient can donate and which cannot, right? But it's been 30 years and they haven't had any complications in the following 30 years.
I mean, a totally normal life.
Many people are born with only one kidney and aren't even aware of it. And it can be supplemented. And patients with kidney disease can also take supplements. There's no problem with creatine. I mean, yes, with what we're talking about, right? With proteins, it's a bit different, yes.
You also said earlier that a 25-year-old patient who starts dialysis will live 40 years less. Yes, I mean, that's brutal. At such a young age, what diseases can cause you to need dialysis?
Mainly autoimmune or genetic diseases. Those are practically the only two that can make someone need dialysis at that age. Well, I've seen some cases of poisoning, for example, from cocaine.
Can cocaine cause kidney loss?
Of course, what cocaine does is cause a severe vasospasm. Just like you can have a heart attack because your coronary artery contracts, the arteries in your kidneys go through a fierce vasoconstriction. And of course, if it continues over time, in the end, you're leaving an organ ischemic.
So it's due to loss of, well, it's pre-renal due to loss of volume.
What they cause is a renal infarction.
A renal infarction, just like in the heart.
Of course, it's the same. It's exactly the same thing. Right. Yes, usually it's due to autoimmune diseases, normally glomerular, or due to hereditary genetic causes.
Do you think the day will come when we can make artificial kidneys and implant them in patients? I mean, I don't know, now with AI, yes.
In some way. I mean, I think we'll be able to do it not too long from now, and research is already heading in that direction to artificially synthesize the cells related to the pathology that's limiting me. That is, if I have a tubular injury, then being able to inject tubular cells, right, to recover that function. Yes, that's the progress so far that, well, makes the most sense, right? Through, well, you know how this always works. Actually, they are stem cells or mesenchymal cells to which you give the signal to differentiate into this cell, right? Yes, and that's mainly the direction they're going. And then, on the other hand, something that, well, is on the table, it's a controversial topic, but what's starting to be done is xenotransplantation, right? Once you develop kidney disease, you can try for a transplant as soon as possible, even from an animal if that's an option, right?
Could it be done from Bueno?
Pig? Well, there are already public experiences with pigs, exactly, yes. There are public experiences and they've even been in the news.
Generally. But pig kidneys transplanted into humans do work well?
They work relatively well, but what happens is that a strong immune response is triggered. A strong one. And then, for me, the problem with this, which hasn't been addressed to this day, is infections, zoonoses. Now that they're so talked about because of the antivirus, zoonoses, which in pigs cause an infection, they have their defenses and are prepared, but humans don't. Of course. So that's kind of the problem. But they have done it, for example, in transplant candidates who have run out of any other options, kind of as a last resort. In the United States, they've done it at least a couple of times, and well, with some survival, yes. Currently, it's not perfect, but offers an alternative. More people need dialysis while kidney availability drops. I'm not referring to Spain, a world leader, but in many other countries, this is the case.
And what would you like to change? If you had a magic wand in nephrology units or, I don't know, in dialysis units or in hospitals in Spain or around the world, how would you improve patient care?
I would love for it to be encouraged once you need to use a machine that everyone could have it available at home. I think coming to a hospital is emotionally overwhelming.
A dialysis machine that people could have at home.
That's called home hemodialysis or peritoneal dialysis. Those are the two ways to do dialysis that exist today, but it barely reaches 10 to 15% of the population on dialysis.
Is it because of money or for some other reason?
No, because it's paid for. This is public. But no, I think it's because it's not incentivized enough, because patients aren't told about the benefits, because it technically requires the patient to have certain skills to be able to do it or to hire someone. That's where,
But does the patient do it alone?
The patient can do it alone. We train them for independence. And in fact, there is an initiative that I really like, which we are launching in Spain, and it's that this type of dialysis is assisted but through public health care. That is, just as public health care provides home hospitalization, it should also provide staff who go to patients' homes and connect them. The emotional impact, the work impact, for example, is extremely important. For these patients, if they have to come to the hospital 12 hours a week,
not hours per week, 4 times 3, right? But also,
what else can I tell you? These machines that are used are completely portable.
they could keep living their lives while traveling.
Traveling, of course. For example, the president of the kidney patients at Alcer, whose name is Danny Gallego, and he's a really great guy. He's a patient who does these kinds of home treatments. He's always traveling and giving lectures, and he talks about his kidney disease. You can look him up online, which is why I'm telling you.
Because it's, of course, public.
And he leads a pretty normal life.
Yes, that would improve the quality.
For me, it would be a clear advantage.
Very interesting, very good. Well, that's it, Borja. Let's wrap up. If you want, tell us what your goal was in writing this book, which is your second one, as I understand.
It's my second popular science book and third overall, since I also wrote a novel under a pseudonym. Well, look, the goal has been to try to shed some light on what's out there about longevity. I think aging is a topic that's talked about too much nowadays, maybe by people who sometimes aren't very well prepared scientifically, right?
That's true. So,
I've tried on one hand to present the science behind aging, real measures, speaking in a way that's easy to understand. And you already know how I talk and how I write, right? Trying to bring it with very normal examples, very informative, very narrative, right? Because I tell a lot of anecdotes. But also eliminating certain myths about things that are useless.
most of them, yes.
Of course. And people shouldn't think these are elixirs, right? I think people can't just lose their healthy habits and then take a pill of X supplement trying to justify that it's enough, right? So that's kind of what the book is about. Great, of course. Speaking of kidneys.
Absolutely. You know, the challenge of not aging, and you can find it on Amazon and in other bookstores. It will teach you a lot about longevity and kidney health. So, well, Borja, we want to thank you so much for sharing all this, for helping people take care of their kidneys, for raising awareness. I think the first episode really raised a lot of awareness about the importance of it all. And I think you have to keep going down that path. You enjoy it too, right? If it felt like a burden, that would be different, but I can see you enjoy it. No, I really like it. Yes, you have fun. Yes. And it's needed. It's needed.
I think so too. Well, I'm delighted and grateful too.
Great, Borja. Well, thank you very much. And to you guys, I hope that in this episode, we've gone a little further than before, that you've learned new things, and above all, practical things. So I'll see you in the next episode. A big hug and keep empowering yourselves.